This is Father Vogel. We continue our series on St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life. We are going through part 4, and in this part we're looking at temptations. We've already been discussing about the difference between temptation and actual sin, that just because we're tempted by something doesn't automatically make it a sin. But now in this chapter we're going to look at how temptation and the pleasure that we might experience from the temptation can indeed be sinful. So he goes back to the example that he has used already, that of the princess. So he says the princess mentioned earlier was not responsible for the dishonorable proposal made to her, since, as we have assumed, it was made against her will. But, on the contrary, if she had by some attitude given encouragement to the proposal, willing to give her love to him who courted her, she would obviously be responsible for the solicitation itself. And even if she then drew back from it, yet she would still be worthy of blame and punishment. So using that example of the man who tries to seduce the princess against her will and against the husband's will, she's not at fault. But if when she receives the proposal through the messenger and she takes pleasure in it, then she does have fault there. Because she then basically encourages the idea by accepting it. And even if at a later point then she finally fully rejects it, she is not completely without fault from it, because she entertained for a while the possibility of following up and actually carrying through. So he says it could happen sometimes that a temptation itself is a sin if we end up being the cause for it. For example, he says, if we know that I give readily to anger and blasphemy when I play, then such games are the occasion of sin. I sin as often as I play, so I am guilty of all the temptations that arise while playing. Similarly, if I know that being in a certain company is an occasion of temptation and sin, and I go there willingly, I am certainly responsible for all the temptations which I face there. So this is one of the things we must be wary of, is that there can be certain places or certain people, certain activities that we do that will make us more susceptible to sins and temptations in the midst of those. So we will often hear the church talk about the near occasion of sin. So we want to avoid these as much as we possibly can. We don't want to get pulled in, trapped by sin. And he says that, those temptations that arise within us are our responsibility. We are culpable of those temptations that arise already because we could have avoided them. But we decided we were going to put ourselves in this compromised situation. So he says, it is always a sin to take pleasure in a temptation, regardless of what degree, whether it's short or long duration, we have partial or full consent. It will be wrong to different degrees. That's why in the church we have venial to mortal sins. He says, if the princess already mentioned not only listens to the impure and dishonorable proposal made to her, but after listening to it also takes pleasure in it, allowing her heart to dwell upon it with delight, she is certainly worthy of blame. Though she may not wish to consent to the realization of what is suggested to her, yet she consents to it interiorly, fixing her heart on it by the pleasure she takes in it. So this is important, that interior is just as or even more important than the exterior. Just because we don't consent by actually doing the external action, but if we ponder it and we're fantasizing about doing it, that is still sinful. even if we don't fully act upon it or even intend to act upon it, even that interior attitude is sinful. He says it's always a sin to turn either the heart or the body to what is sinful. However, the sin consists so much in the consent of the heart that without it, even the consent of the body cannot be sin. So, sin really has its origin in the heart first, prior to the body. So, every sin of the body is going to be having the consent of the heart within it as well. But if the act of the body was there without any consent, then it would remove the fact that something was a sin. So there's going to be that kind of interior movement of the heart toward the temptation, towards acting upon the sin, whether there's an actual acting out physically, externally or not. And when that movement of the heart is in that direction, then that temptation indeed is a sin. So we can always ask ourselves, did I expose myself to the risk of temptation? Could I have easily avoided the occasion? Or should I have foreseen the coming of that temptation? If so, you are guilty of it. If we could have foreseen, I knew that if I put myself in that situation, I was going to have to deal with this temptation, but I decided to do it anyway. Then we're guilty of the fact that we even had that temptation. He says, when it could have been avoided, when the temptation could have been avoided, then it is a sin for us. So we want to try as best we can to avoid those near occasions of sin. St. Francis is now going to go through some various degrees of situations and how we might respond to temptations to help us understand, which ones, to what degree are they sinful or not. So the first instance, he says, at times we might be surprised by some feeling of pleasure which immediately follows the temptation before we have had time to be aware of it. This can at most be a very light venial sin. So in this case, we begin to feel the pleasure, and in a sense here there's some consent to it even before we kind of are fully realizing it. And he says, well, at most that's going to be venial, because sin really requires our full consent of the will. The second instance, he says, it becomes more serious if, seeing the evil, we are negligent and bargain with the pleasure for a long time whether we should accept or reject it. So it's going to be much more serious, he says, if when we notice that there's the temptation there, we begin to kind of, bargain with it, he says. So we begin to think, well, is it really all that bad? Maybe I could do that just this one time, or maybe, saying this lie in this instance would be okay. We begin to kind of rationalize our way. And even if in the end we decide against it, this is a very dangerous thing for us to do, is bargaining with that temptation. Next, he says that the sin is greater still if, after perceiving the pleasure, we continue in it for some time through real negligence without any intention of rejecting it. So if we have a temptation and even mentally kind of sitting within the pleasure of thinking about it, and we have no really intention of rejecting it, and we just kind of, let it flow through without turning back to God, then that becomes even worse. And then finally, the fourth one, he says, is if we willingly and deliberately resolve to accept such pleasure, even this deliberate intention is a grave sin if the object of the pleasure was notably evil. So in this case, we deliberately accept the temptation, even if it's before we actually, if it's a temptation that has an external aspect to it, even if we don't follow through, or even before we follow through, it's already sinful. And then, of course, the action then of actually doing it is the fruition, in a sense, of that consenting to it. So, hopefully, in delineating some of these levels, we can kind of apply it in those cases where we have temptations, and help us to, especially when we're examining our conscience, understand, when are those cases that when I had that temptation, I indeed carried through on it, or maybe there's some of those cases in which, through the grace of God, I was able to resist the temptation and avoid sin. God bless.